People like you should keep your eyes on the floor, Richard Sterling said with a smile that never reached his eyes, and the laughter that followed rolled across the polished boardroom like it belonged there. Naomi Brooks lowered her gaze without a word, bent to pick up the white cleaning cloth that had landed near the toe of her shoe, and quietly smoothed a wrinkle from its edge before placing it back on her cart. Around her, 12 executives in tailored suits gathered beneath a chandelier that reflected off the endless glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago. Morning sunlight poured across the 42nd floor, turning the conference table into a mirror of wealth and power. To everyone else, Naomi was just another housekeeper in a Navy uniform, someone whose footsteps disappeared beneath the hum of expensive conversations and the clicking of designer pens. She had worked in Sterling Capital's headquarters for almost 3 years, arriving every weekday before sunrise, polishing the marble floors before the first elevator carried executives to their corner offices. Most employees never remembered her name. Some nodded politely. Others walked straight past her as if she blended into the walls. Richard Sterling belonged to the last group. America admired him as the billionaire who could close billion-dollar deals before lunch and still appear on financial television before dinner. Investors called him brilliant. Business magazines called him fearless. Employees simply called him Mr. Sterling. His reputation filled every hallway of the building long before he entered it. This morning mattered more than any other. Within the hour, Sterling Capital would finalize the acquisition of a technology company in a transaction worth billions, a deal every financial network was already calling historic. Lawyers organized contracts into perfect stacks, while assistants adjusted presentation screens displaying charts covered with soaring revenue projections and flawless forecasts. Every number looked polished. Every smile looked rehearsed. Richard glanced toward Naomi only once, his expression carrying the quiet certainty that success belonged to people who sat around conference tables, never to those pushing cleaning carts. Make sure those windows shine, he added casually without looking back. Some of us have real work to do. Another wave of restrained laughter drifted through the room. Naomi simply nodded. Yes, sir. Her voice remained calm, steady, almost invisible. She rolled her cart toward the far end of the room where sunlight poured through the towering windows. As she wiped fingerprints from the glass, a leather briefcase resting beside the chief financial officer's chair tipped slightly when someone brushed past it. A slim presentation folder slipped free and landed partially open against the polished floor. No one noticed. Every eye remained fixed on the presentation screen where projections of enormous profits continued to glow. Naomi crouched to retrieve the folder before someone stepped on it. She intended only to place it back exactly where it belonged. But as she lifted it, a single spreadsheet became visible for barely a second. A sequence of figures caught her attention, numbers arranged with such mathematical perfection that something deep inside her memory stirred before she could stop it. Her hand froze. Her breathing slowed. The room buzzed with confidence. Yet one impossible pattern hidden among millions of dollars had suddenly become impossible for her to ignore. Naomi carefully slid the loose page back into the folder exactly as she had found it, but the pattern she had glimpsed refused to leave her mind. It was only a handful of numbers, nothing anyone else in that room would have noticed during a hurried morning before a major acquisition, yet to her they stood out like fingerprints left on perfectly polished glass. She placed the folder beside the chief financial officer's chair without drawing attention to herself, and quietly continued wiping the windows, her movements as calm and practiced as they had been every morning for years. Nobody looked in her direction. That was the strange advantage of being invisible. People rarely guarded themselves against someone they never truly saw. Few people inside Sterling Capital knew anything about Naomi Brooks beyond the embroidered name stitched across her uniform. They assumed she had spent her entire life cleaning offices because that was the only version of her they had ever imagined. They never knew she had once been the top student in a forensic accounting program at Northwestern University. Professors had predicted she would become one of the country's brightest financial investigators before life interrupted every carefully planned dream. When her father passed away unexpectedly and her mother developed a serious illness only months later, tuition became impossible to afford. Naomi withdrew from school halfway through her final year without telling most of her classmates. She accepted temporary jobs that slowly became permanent because hospital bills always arrived before opportunities did. The textbooks disappeared, but the discipline never did. Even after exhausting overnight shifts, she still borrowed accounting journals from the public library, solved financial case studies in old notebooks, and challenged herself to trace complex fraud investigations published by federal regulators. Her mind had never stopped looking for patterns because that was how she had been trained to think. Numbers carried stories. Honest numbers moved naturally. Dishonest numbers often tried too hard to appear perfect. That lesson had stayed with her longer than any classroom lecture. She returned her attention to the towering windows while the executives discussed market confidence, shareholder value, and projected earnings. Their voices blended into the soft hum of the ventilation system. The scent of fresh coffee drifted across the room. Expensive watches reflected the morning light each time another executive gestured toward the presentation screen. Then Naomi noticed the chief financial officer, Ethan Caldwell. Unlike everyone else celebrating the upcoming transaction, Ethan was not watching the presentation. His eyes kept drifting toward the same leather briefcase resting beside his chair. Every few seconds he adjusted its position with unusual care before glancing toward Richard Sterling with a practiced smile. It was a tiny habit, almost impossible to notice unless someone had already been paying close attention. Naomi slowed her breathing. She remembered the spreadsheet, the repeated sequence, the identical decimal placements. Financial statements involving different companies almost never repeated complex figures with such precision unless they originated from the same underlying calculation. It could have been coincidence. It could have been an innocent formatting error. Or it could have been something much larger hiding beneath pages designed to impress investors instead of revealing the truth. As Richard prepared to sign the first authorization document, Naomi quietly placed the spray bottle back onto her cleaning cart. But for the first time since joining Sterling Capital, she found herself wondering whether staying silent would be the greater mistake. Richard Sterling accepted the silver fountain pen from his attorney with the quiet confidence of a man who believed every major decision in his life had already been won long before the ink ever touched the paper. Around the conference table, directors exchanged satisfied glances while investment bankers reviewed their final notes one last time. A digital clock mounted beside the presentation screen counted down the remaining minutes before the signing ceremony would begin. Outside the towering windows, helicopters drifted above the Chicago skyline, while morning traffic crawled below like tiny streams of light. Everything about the moment reflected certainty. Every graph projected record growth. Every forecast promised extraordinary returns. Every executive had repeated the same phrase all week. This acquisition would transform Sterling Capital forever. Ethan Caldwell stood beside the enormous display screen, speaking with polished confidence that came from years of earning the complete trust of the board. He moved effortlessly through complex financial projections, explaining revenue integration, operating efficiencies, and projected shareholder gains with the smooth rhythm of someone who had rehearsed every sentence dozens of times. Whenever questions arose, he answered immediately, never pausing long enough to appear uncertain. Richard watched with quiet satisfaction. Ethan had been his closest financial advisor for nearly 12 years. They had celebrated victories together, survived difficult markets together, and built an empire together. If Richard trusted anyone outside his own family, it was Ethan Caldwell. That trust had become the foundation beneath every major investment Sterling Capital had made during the past decade. Naomi remained near the windows, slowly polishing fingerprints from the glass, while listening without appearing to listen. She noticed details other people overlooked. Ethan never allowed anyone else to touch the printed financial binders. Every time an assistant reached toward the stack, he instinctively pulled them closer before offering only the pages each person needed. His smile remained warm, yet his hands betrayed a quiet possessiveness that seemed strangely out of place during such a confident presentation. Then another detail caught Naomi's attention. One chart displayed projected cash reserves immediately after the acquisition closed. The total matched one of the unusual figures she had glimpsed inside the loose spreadsheet only minutes earlier. The exact placement of the decimals. The exact sequence of trailing digits. It appeared again. Different account. Different explanation. The same mathematical fingerprint. Her heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Panic rarely helped anyone discover the truth. Observation did. She carefully studied the screen while pretending to straighten a row of decorative plants beside the windows. Ethan advanced to the next slide so quickly that most people never had time to compare one page with another. But Naomi's memory held numbers the way musicians remembered melodies. She silently repeated the figures inside her mind until they settled into place. Something beneath those polished presentations refused to fit. It was almost invisible, hidden beneath impressive language and colorful charts, yet it lingered like a faint crack beneath fresh paint. Richard finally stood, buttoning his tailored jacket as applause filled the room. His lead attorney slid the signature documents across the glossy conference table while cameras from the company's communications department quietly prepared to capture the historic moment for shareholders. One signature would authorize billions of dollars to change hands before noon. Naomi rested both hands lightly on the handle of her cleaning cart. She looked from Richard to Ethan, then toward the contracts waiting beneath the fountain pen. The room radiated absolute confidence, but the silent pattern she had discovered refused to disappear. Instead, with every passing second, it became clearer than the spotless glass reflecting the city beyond. Naomi could have walked away. No one had asked for her opinion. No one expected a housekeeper to understand merger documents or financial models. She only needed to finish polishing the windows, collect her supplies, and disappear into another hallway before the meeting ended. That was what everyone expected. That was what would keep her invisible. But the numbers would not let her leave. She quietly glanced once more at the presentation screen while Richard Sterling uncapped his fountain pen. Ethan Caldwell advanced to another slide, proudly explaining the final balance sheet after the acquisition. Applause echoed softly around the room as several board members nodded in approval. Naomi's eyes moved from the projected figures to the printed binders resting on the conference table. 3 separate reports. 3 different subsidiaries. 3 different revenue streams. Yet the same pattern appeared again, hidden beneath different account names. The depreciation ratios were identical down to the 4th decimal place. The reserve adjustments increased by exactly the same percentage across unrelated divisions. Independent businesses almost never behaved with such mathematical symmetry. Real companies were messy. Markets fluctuated. Expenses shifted. Human decisions created irregularities. Only manipulated numbers stayed perfectly disciplined. Naomi felt a quiet chill despite the warmth of the sunlight filling the room. This was not a careless mistake. Someone had built an entire structure designed to appear flawless. She lowered her cleaning cloth onto the cart and looked once more toward Ethan. His confidence remained effortless, but his right hand tapped the conference table with the same steady rhythm every few seconds. It was the only sign that something beneath his calm exterior might not be as composed as it appeared. Richard accepted the signature folder from the company's lead attorney. Cameras adjusted their focus. One assistant whispered that investors were already waiting for the official announcement. Everything had reached the point where no one wanted delays. Naomi swallowed quietly. She remembered something one of her accounting professors had said years earlier. Fraud does not survive because numbers are clever. It survives because honest people convince themselves that speaking is not their responsibility. Those words had stayed with her long after she left the university. She looked at the signature page lying before Richard. If those reports concealed what she believed they did, today's celebration would become tomorrow's disaster. Hundreds of employees could lose their retirement savings. Thousands of investors could place their trust in financial statements built upon fiction. The thought settled heavily inside her chest. She did not care about impressing executives. She cared about the truth. Taking one slow breath, Naomi stepped away from the windows. The soft wheels of her cleaning cart rolled quietly across the marble floor before coming to a stop near the end of the conference table. Nobody noticed at first. Every eye remained fixed on Richard as he positioned the pen above the contract. Naomi's heart beat steadily. Fear was present, but it no longer controlled her. She raised her voice just enough to be heard across the suddenly quiet room. "Excuse me, sir." The pen stopped less than an inch above the paper. Richard slowly turned his head, surprise replacing confidence for the first time that morning. Every conversation ended at once. Even the air inside the boardroom seemed to stand still. Naomi met his eyes with calm respect. "I believe those financial statements contain a pattern that should be reviewed before anyone signs anything today." Silence settled over the boardroom so completely that the quiet hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed louder than the voices that had filled the room only. Seconds earlier, Richard Sterling slowly lowered the fountain pen onto the polished table and stared at Naomi as though he had forgotten she was even standing there. Then a faint smile crossed his face, followed by a soft laugh that quickly spread around the conference table. Several executives exchanged amused glances, while one of the attorneys leaned back in his chair, clearly assuming the interruption would end as quickly as it had begun. Richard folded his hands and looked directly at Naomi. "Do you have any idea what meeting you just interrupted?" His voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of authority. Naomi stood quietly with both hands resting on the handle of her cleaning cart. "Yes, sir," she answered. "That is exactly why I felt I had to speak." Richard shook his head slowly. "You are here to clean windows, not review financial statements." More restrained laughter followed. Ethan Caldwell smiled politely, although relief flashed briefly across his face before disappearing behind his usual confidence. He stepped forward with measured composure. "Mr. Sterling, I believe she probably misunderstood something she happened to see. Financial reporting can appear complicated to someone unfamiliar with corporate accounting." Several board members nodded in agreement without questioning his explanation. Naomi remained perfectly still. "I understand that possibility," she replied. "But identical adjustment ratios repeated across unrelated subsidiaries deserve another look before these documents are signed." Ethan's smile barely changed. "That is an impressive sentence," he said. "Where exactly did you learn terminology like that?" The question sounded polite, yet everyone understood the meaning behind it. Richard glanced toward Naomi's uniform before speaking again. "Our executives have decades of experience. Independent auditors have reviewed these reports. National law firms prepared every document sitting on this table. Are you asking this board to believe that everyone missed something a housekeeper somehow discovered while cleaning windows?" The room filled with quiet chuckles. Naomi did not react to the laughter. "I am only asking that someone compare the reserve adjustments across all three divisions before signing." Richard's expression hardened. "Enough." The single word cut through the room with unmistakable finality. He stood from his chair and buttoned his jacket. Confidence is earned through years of education, responsibility, and results. You cannot interrupt a board meeting because you think you noticed something on a page you were never meant to examine. Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully for only a moment before meeting his gaze again. "Sir, the numbers are repeating because they were built from the same calculation. That should not happen if the statements are independent." Ethan stepped closer to Richard and quietly placed a reassuring hand against the stack of financial binders. "This is becoming a distraction," he said. Richard nodded once. Security. The conference room doors opened almost immediately as two building security officers entered after hearing the raised voices from outside. Richard pointed calmly toward Naomi's cleaning cart. "Please escort her from this floor. She has interrupted official corporate business." Neither officer appeared angry. One simply approached Naomi with professional courtesy and quietly asked her to come with them. She looked once around the conference table. No one defended her. No one asked to review the figures she had mentioned. The executives returned their attention to the contracts as though the interruption had already been erased from memory. Naomi gently wrapped both hands around the handle of her cart and turned toward the door without another word. But as she stepped into the hallway, she realized that leaving the room did not mean leaving the truth behind. The elevator doors closed with a quiet chime, sealing Naomi away from the polished confidence of the executive floor. She stood alone beside her cleaning cart as the numbers above the doors slowly counted downward. No one spoke. The two security officers had remained respectful until the elevator arrived, then simply wished her a good day before returning upstairs. They had only followed instructions. Naomi never blamed them. When the doors opened onto the employee level, the sounds of expensive presentations disappeared, replaced by the familiar rhythm of rolling supply carts, humming vacuum cleaners, and distant conversations drifting through maintenance corridors. Warm sunlight filtered through a narrow window at the end of the hallway, falling across the worn gray floor where countless employees had walked without ever stopping to notice the quiet people who kept the building running every day. Naomi slowly pushed her cart toward the housekeeping room. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because Richard Sterling had dismissed her, but because she knew time was running out. Once the contracts were signed, whatever had been hidden inside those financial statements would become much harder to expose. She entered the small break room reserved for the maintenance staff. It was simple, clean, and quiet. A coffee maker rested beside a microwave that had seen years of use. Family photographs covered one bulletin board. Someone had left a handwritten note thanking the night crew for helping prepare the building before an important event. Naomi smiled faintly. Kindness often lived in the smallest places. She parked her cleaning cart beside a metal locker and carefully opened the bottom storage compartment, hidden beneath folded towels and spare cleaning supplies. From the back corner, she removed an old blue flash drive attached to a faded keychain. It looked ordinary, almost forgotten, yet it contained months of careful observations. During late evening cleaning shifts, discarded draft reports had occasionally been left inside recycling bins outside conference rooms. Naomi had never taken confidential information home, but whenever duplicate copies were marked for disposal, she compared financial summaries against publicly available filings, studying them only to sharpen the skills she thought she had left behind years earlier. Each unusual pattern had been documented with dates, public records, and calculations completed on her own time. She had never imagined those notes might one day matter. She plugged the flash drive into an aging employee computer used for scheduling housekeeping assignments. The screen flickered to life. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet appeared, each one organized with careful precision. Columns highlighted recurring reserve adjustments. Charts compared quarterly filings. Public disclosures sat beside archived draft figures. The repeated mathematical fingerprints she had recognized upstairs appeared again and again across different reporting periods. This morning had not created her suspicion. It had confirmed it. Naomi leaned back quietly, listening to the soft hum of the computer. Outside the small window, clouds drifted across the bright Chicago sky, briefly dimming the sunlight before allowing it to shine again. She folded her hands together, remembering the words her mother often repeated whenever life demanded difficult choices. Doing the right thing rarely feels comfortable, but comfort has never been the measure of character. Naomi closed her eyes for only a moment, then opened a new electronic message addressed to the independent audit committee listed on the company's corporate governance page. One by one, she attached the supporting analysis she had built over many patient months. Her finger rested above the send button. The room remained perfectly still. Somewhere far above her, executives were preparing to celebrate history. Naomi quietly pressed send. Upstairs, the atmosphere inside the boardroom had returned to its polished rhythm. Richard Sterling signed the final authorization page as cameras quietly captured the historic moment. Applause filled the room once again. Attorneys shook hands. Board members congratulated one another. Ethan Caldwell accepted several compliments with the relaxed confidence of a man whose work had just earned another victory. An assistant began preparing the official press release that would announce the acquisition before the stock market closed that afternoon. Richard stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out across the Chicago skyline with the satisfaction of someone convinced another chapter of success had just been written. Then a sharp notification sounded from the general counsel's laptop. At first, nobody paid attention. The attorney glanced at the screen, expecting another routine confirmation from outside legal advisors. Instead, the color slowly disappeared from his face. He adjusted his glasses and read the message again before quietly standing from his chair. "Mr. Sterling," he said carefully, "we may need to pause the public announcement." Richard turned with visible impatience. "The contracts have already been signed. I understand, sir, but the independent audit committee has issued an immediate review request. They received supporting documentation alleging material financial irregularities connected to this transaction." The room fell silent. Ethan's smile remained in place, but his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Richard frowned. "What kind of irregularities?" The attorney rotated the laptop toward him. Attached to the message were dozens of organized spreadsheets, comparison tables, public filings, archived reports, and mathematical analyses tracing identical adjustment patterns across multiple subsidiaries over several fiscal years. Every document was clearly labeled. Every calculation could be followed step by step. Nothing relied on speculation. It relied entirely on numbers. Richard leaned closer. The precision was extraordinary. Every repeated ratio Naomi had tried to explain in only a few seconds now appeared across page after page of detailed evidence. Before anyone could speak again, another notification arrived. Then another. The external auditing firm confirmed that they had independently verified several of the highlighted discrepancies within minutes of receiving the supporting documents. Trading advisors recommended delaying all public communications until the review could be completed. One board member quietly removed his reading glasses. Another slowly closed his notebook without saying a word. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier dissolved into uneasy silence. Richard looked toward Ethan. "Tell me this is wrong." Ethan forced a small laugh that sounded far less certain than before. "These are probably misunderstandings created by someone who does not know how our internal adjustments work." "Then explain them," Richard replied. Ethan opened one of the spreadsheets and began speaking, but his explanation quickly lost its smooth rhythm. Each answer created another question. Each clarification exposed another inconsistency. The same numerical fingerprints Naomi had noticed appeared again in reports from different years, different divisions, and different acquisitions. One director quietly whispered, "This cannot be a coincidence." Minutes later, the lead auditor joined the meeting through a secure video conference. After reviewing only a portion of the evidence, she spoke with calm professionalism. "Based on the documentation submitted this morning, we have sufficient reason to believe the financial statements require a comprehensive forensic investigation before any further integration activities continue. Preliminary estimates indicate the potential exposure could exceed $500 million. Nobody moved. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair without taking his eyes off the evidence spread across the conference table. Only then did he notice the final page attached to the submission. At the bottom, beneath months of careful analysis, appeared a simple electronic signature. Naomi Brooks. The boardroom remained silent long after the video conference ended. No one reached for the untouched coffee cups. No one celebrated the acquisition anymore. The bright morning sunlight still streamed through the enormous windows, but it no longer reflected triumph. Instead, it illuminated stacks of financial reports that suddenly felt heavier than anyone in the room could carry. Richard Sterling slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the conference table. For the first time in years, he realized that the greatest threat to his company had not come from competitors or market conditions. It had come from his own willingness to dismiss a voice because of the uniform it wore. He replayed the morning in his mind. Naomi had not interrupted to embarrass him. She had not demanded recognition. She had not spoken with arrogance. She had simply asked for the numbers to be reviewed before anyone signed the documents. The warning had been calm, respectful, and entirely focused on protecting the company. Richard closed the folder containing Naomi's analysis and stood without saying a word. Every executive instinctively watched him. "Where is she?" he finally asked. No one answered immediately. An assistant quietly checked the employee scheduling system before looking back toward Richard. "She should still be on the maintenance level, sir." Richard walked out of the boardroom without waiting for anyone else. Several directors followed him through the executive hallway, their polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. The same employees who had smiled confidently only an hour earlier now stepped aside in complete silence as the group entered the elevator. When the doors opened on the maintenance floor, the atmosphere changed immediately. The expensive perfume of executive offices gave way to the familiar scent of fresh soap, clean linen, and recently polished floors. Richard spotted Naomi at the far end of the corridor. She was quietly replacing supplies on her cleaning cart exactly as she had done every other morning. Nothing about her posture suggested she expected anyone to come looking for her. Richard approached slowly until he stood only a few feet away. Naomi looked up with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the morning. Neither anger nor satisfaction appeared on her face. Richard took a slow breath before speaking. "Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology." The hallway became completely still. Maintenance workers nearby quietly paused their tasks without interrupting. Richard continued, his voice lower than anyone in the executive offices had ever heard before. "I judged your position instead of your character. I believed your job determined the value of your words. I was wrong." Naomi listened without interrupting. Richard extended the folder containing her analysis. "You protected this company when everyone else, including me, failed to see what was directly in front of us. Naomi accepted the folder gently, but did not open it. I was only trying to prevent people from being hurt, she answered softly. Numbers affect families, employees, retirees, and communities. They are never just numbers. Richard nodded slowly. Those words settled deeper than any financial report ever had. The board has suspended the transaction and launched a full independent investigation. We would like to ask for your help during the review, if you are willing. Naomi glanced briefly at the employees standing quietly along the hallway before returning her eyes to Richard. I will help because the truth deserves to be understood, she said. Not because I need anyone to prove my worth. Richard lowered his head with quiet respect. For the first time in many years, the billionaire understood that genuine integrity could never be measured by a title on an office door, a tailored suit, or the floor where someone happened to work. The weeks that followed changed Sterling Capital in ways no quarterly report could ever measure. Independent forensic auditors worked alongside federal regulators, reviewing years of financial records one page at a time. Every conclusion pointed to the same truth Naomi Brooks had recognized from a single glance inside the boardroom. The investigation uncovered a sophisticated scheme that had quietly distorted financial statements and concealed more than $500 million in fraudulent activity. Investors were informed honestly. Employees received regular updates instead of carefully polished promises. The company accepted responsibility, strengthened its internal controls, and began rebuilding the trust that numbers alone could never restore. Richard Sterling insisted that every recommendation from the independent investigators be implemented without delay. For the first time in the company's history, every employee, regardless of position, was given a direct and confidential way to report concerns without fear of being ignored. Richard often repeated a lesson he wished he had learned much earlier. The most dangerous mistake a leader can make is believing wisdom only comes from people sitting at the biggest table. Naomi never asked for recognition. She continued arriving before sunrise, greeting security officers by name and smiling at coworkers who had always treated her with kindness. When the board officially offered her a senior advisory role supporting financial integrity and internal oversight, she accepted only after asking one question. She wanted to know whether she would be allowed to continue visiting the maintenance staff who had become like family during her years in housekeeping. Richard smiled for the first time in weeks and answered without hesitation. You belong wherever your work helps people. On her first morning in the new position, Naomi walked through the same lobby where countless employees had once hurried past without noticing her. The marble floors reflected the early sunlight just as they always had. The revolving doors welcomed another busy day. The elevators chimed softly as people arrived carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Yet something had quietly changed. Employees who crossed her path no longer looked through her. They looked at her. Some nodded with genuine respect. Others thanked her for protecting the company they depended on to support their families. Naomi returned every greeting with the same gentle smile she had worn long before anyone knew her name. As she stepped into the executive elevator, she noticed a familiar cleaning cart waiting near the hallway. For a brief moment, she reached out and carefully straightened the folded white cleaning cloth resting neatly on top. It was a simple gesture, almost invisible, but it reminded her that dignity had never come from a job title. It had always come from the way a person chose to serve others with honesty and compassion. Upstairs, Richard stood quietly beside the boardroom windows where the story had begun. The city stretched across the horizon beneath a bright blue sky. He watched Naomi walk calmly through the hallway, no longer as someone hidden in the background, but as someone whose courage had changed the future of an entire company. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The silence carried everything words could not. Sunlight spilled across the polished floor, reflecting from the glass walls onto the place where a cleaning cart had once stood beside a conference table filled with powerful people. This time, there was no laughter, no judgment, and no voices deciding who mattered. There was only quiet respect, the steady rhythm of a new beginning, and the enduring truth that character will always shine brighter than status when the light finally reaches every corner of the room.